On the
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
amendment.
Chairman.
When I first came to Congress, Mr. Chairman, I had the great honor of befriending the gentleman from Alaska, the Dean of the House, Don Young. I had the privilege of sitting next to Don for 5 years before his death. Don told me when I first came to Congress, he said, "Clay, if you want to understand this body, you have to understand a simple fact." He said the Republican Party is primarily a party of businessmen. The Democrat Party is primarily a party of attorneys. That's being shown quite clearly today. So let this old street cop give some of our fancy attorneys on the other side of the aisle a little history lesson. When it was first proposed to limit impeachments in the American Constitution to treason and bribery alone, Virginia Delegate George Mason pointed out that Hastings, who was being impeached at the time by Parliament, is not guilty of treason. Mason questioned the wisdom of limiting impeachment to those two offenses, arguing that treason is defined in the Constitution, as defined in the Constitution, would not reach many great and dangerous offenses that attempts to subvert the Constitution may not be treason as defined, and that it's the more necessary to extend the power of impeachments. Mason then moved that the convention add maladministration to the impeachment power. Eldridge Gerry seconded the motion. Then James Madison argued that the term maladministration was deviated from the more commonly recognized phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, was so vague a term that it would be the equivalent to a tenure during pleasure of the Senate. Quote of Madison. Governor Morris agreed with Madison, at which point Mason withdrew his motion and substituted as grounds for impeachment, quote, bribery and high crimes and misdemeanors. Bribery and other high crimes and misdemeanors. The motion carried without any further discussion of the new phrase, which ultimately became part of the Constitution. Here's the bottom line. As historians summarize, the actions of the delegates of the Constitutional Convention stated that, in summary, through the early debates, every speaker referred to neglect of duty and misconduct in office as impeachable offenses. And after Madison objected to the vagueness of the proposed impeachment clause, Mason then moved to add high crimes and misdemeanors. This passed 8-3 and became the orthodox phraseology. The vote in favor of the compromise motion suggests that the delegates understood that the new terms included neglect of duty. The addition of misdemeanors to the list of offenses meant that the House of Representatives was permitted to charge officials with misuse of power and neglect of duty. As has been quoted by many scholars, specifically, the term misdemeanors in its original meaning carried with it less the sense of a smaller or less serious criminal law offense, which would be today's common usage of the word, and more the broader sense of misconduct or misbehavior, literally of not demeaning oneself properly, misdemeaning in the exercise of an official capacity or position. The breadth of the constitutional language employed as a standard for impeachment thus plainly embraces a range of congressional judgment extending beyond bare criminality as to what types of culpable official misconduct so amount to a betrayal of trust, responsibility, duty, or integrity as to warrant removal from office. And that's where we are today.
Will the gentleman...
My colleagues, no, I will not. You didn't yield to me, my brother. My colleagues across the aisle seem to say that it's acceptable that we've had 10 million illegal crossings in 3 years. That we've had pushing 300,000 Americans dead from opioid overdose. We're losing our country down there. And the man responsible for executing that policy is Alejandro Mayorkas. He will be impeached through this committee this day. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Mr. Chairman. Gentleman yields. Mr. Chairman.
For 5 minutes, you've got big shoes to fill from your colleague in Florida that you succeeded here.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, my colleague from Florida, Mr. Moskowitz, this is actually old hat for us back from our days in the Florida legislature. Look, a couple of things. These hearings, I do agree, typically are fun, but the reality is that regulations at the federal level, and I think it's important to stress a couple of things. Regulations at the federal level, over-regulation at the federal level does have a massive undue burden on small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and micro businesses, these are your mom and pop businesses that are started by a lot of people in our country all across every socioeconomic background. The big players, the Fortune 500 guys, they don't really care too much, actually, about regulation. The area we're seeing that more, I believe, than in any other part of our government happens to be in the financial industry. In the financial industry, the big banks really don't care. I had a meeting, actually, with some of the larger banks, their representatives. And I said, well, guys, you know, the regulatory environment in banking is really restrictive. It's going to cause us major issues. What if we just got rid of Dodd-Frank? You know, it was passed on a partisan basis many years ago. I believe it's probably the worst financial regulatory framework we've ever created. It actually has done the thing that we were told it would never do. It actually made the big banks bigger. And we were told that it would stop too big to fail. Well, we all see now that's not true. What do you think about getting rid of it? And you know what they say? They say, well, we've kind of already built out our programming and compliance system, so it's kind of hard to get out of that. Meanwhile, small banks are being eviscerated. Let's talk about where we are today. In March of 2022, the Department of Labor began to scrutinize and recommend against all 401k plans that include the opportunity to invest in cryptocurrencies, i.e., that's telling small businesses and businesses that in 401k plans that they actually sponsor for their employees, that cryptocurrency options shouldn't be allowed for the employees to invest in. Mr. White, do you view this as an overregulation from the Biden administration?
Thank you for your question, and yes, I do.
Number two, the EPA, under the Biden administration, has actually set a very ambitious and unrealistic emissions regulated goal for electric vehicle deployment throughout the United States. I just had a meeting with a bunch of car dealers, and you know what they're telling me? They're saying that nobody comes into a car dealership looking for an electric vehicle. But the Biden administration's own emissions policy is force-feeding electric vehicles onto the auto markets here in the United States. Professor Mulligan, do you believe this is an excessive overregulation of the auto industry?
Yes, we looked at the even more gentle regulations through the compliance market was costing hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2 when President Obama said it was only worth $50. So it has Americans way overpaying for a comparatively minor environmental benefit. Added on top of, they're cutting back the supply of electricity that we're supposed to charge these things with. So economically, it's really amazing thing for me to watch, but it's going to be hard for consumers to deal with.
Now listen, Director Chopra is actually in financial services right now. I'll be seeing him soon. But the CFPB is trying to enact Rule 1071, something from Dodd-Frank that has taken them about 12 years to try to figure out, and they finally want to get around to that too. And the desire is to increase reporting requirements of financial institutions when they give loans to small businesses and et cetera, and all these kind of business levels. Ms. Katzen, do you think that the CFPB extends itself into overregulating companies within our entire economic system? Do you think that?
No, sir. I think they have been acutely aware of the statutory authorities that they have been granted, and that they have done remarkably well in helping individuals who are often confronted with financial documents they cannot understand.
Well, let me ask you this question, because last time I checked, Ms. Katzen, the CFPB does not help people read their financial documents. What the CFPB does is they walk around fining companies for activities that the CFPB thinks that are not helpful to the consumer. But what we also understand, and what I definitely understand, is that the CFPB is unaccountable. They don't have to report to Congress. And frankly, that's in front of the Supreme Court now. And they try to defend having their own director not being answerable to the President of the United States. So do you think it is constitutional to have an agency with policing powers and finding powers under the auspices of the United States government to be wholly unaccountable to Congress? Do you think that's constitutional, Ms. Katzen?
That case is before the Supreme Court.
No, I'm not asking the Supreme Court. I'm asking you.
Well, they had previously decided the cellular law case in which they held that the director could be fired by the president. He did not have an at-cause will. And the reason that the CFPB is able to select certain documents that they want to question is because of complaints that come in. And from information that they receive, they don't just make up their own mind.
I am over time. And that's an interesting point you were making. Mr. White, I'm going to let you answer because I see you were chomping at the bit, and I think that's going to close us out. Go ahead.
I'll be brief, Mr. Chairman. I'll just say I've been working on this issue for more than a decade since Dodd-Frank was created. I helped C. Boyden Gray and others file the original constitutional lawsuits. And while it's true that with respect to the CFPB, the Supreme Court has corrected the problem of a lack of executive branch accountability, from the start, the greatest flaw in the CFPB's construction was making it independent of Congress's power of the purse and allowing the CFPB to treat the Federal Reserve as its own independent slush fund. I'm very glad that the Supreme Court is reviewing that issue this fall, and I hope the Supreme Court follows through similarly as to in the Seal of Law case.
All right, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Chair recognizes.
Lạnh buồn ơi, khuya nay anh đi rồi, bao nhớ nhung xa vời, ôi nói không nên lời để cạn niềm yêu mến anh. Phút gần gũi này thôi, tay không rời, mắt ngắm xa chân trời, mà lòng nghe nhớ thương hoài. Anh ơi, chớ quên ngày mai đã có em chờ anh, chung xây đẹp ý đời. Tương lai ấp trên môi, yêu nhau ta thầm nói, nụ cười trao duyên mới, ước vọng để mà vui. Khuya nay anh đi rồi, đem chí trai xây đời, đem mến thương cho người người đợi chờ anh. Gần gũi này thôi, khuya nay anh đi rồi, tay nắm tay không rời, mắt ngắm xa chân trời, mà lòng nghe nhớ thương hoài. Anh ơi, chớ quên ngày mai đã có em chờ anh, chung xây đẹp ý đời. vọng để mà vui. Khuya nay anh đi rồi, đem chí trai xây đời, đem mến thương cho người người đợi chờ anh ơi. Đem chí trai